Hi, everyone.
Hello. In a prior segment, we were in Matthew 16, making the point that the word church, ecclesia, only occurs twice in Matthew. Once when Christ says in Matthew 16, "Upon this rock I will build my church," and the second time here. And interestingly enough, it's not just only two times in Matthew. It's only two times that the word ecclesia is used in all four Gospels, although it becomes very common in Acts and in the epistles. So we should try to know something about the context of the word ecclesia in those days, because it's almost like a side glance here at this concept of ecclesia, as if they would already know what it was when Matthew wrote his gospel. He doesn't have to spell it out for them. So why don't we read from 18:15 down to verse 20.
Moreover, if your brother commits a sin, go lay bare his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take along with you one or two more, in order that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every matter may be established. If he does not listen to them, speak to the congregation. If he does not listen even to the congregation, let him be to you just as a man of the nations and as a tax collector. Truly I say to you, men, whatever things you may bind on earth will be things bound in heaven, and whatever things you may loose on earth will be things loosed in heaven. Again, I truly say to you, if 2 of you on earth agree concerning anything of importance that they should request, it will take place for them, due to my Father in heaven. For where there are 2 or 3 gathered together in my name, there I am in their midst.
There am I among them in the ESV. So, first of all, we should remember that often this verse 20, is taken out of context.
Yeah.
You realize it's often used as a kind of an excuse not to assemble in larger bodies, as if it defines what church could be in the future. 2 or 3 people gathered in Jesus' name.
As long as there's at least 2 or 3 of us, we're okay.
But in the context, as you can see, it doesn't mean anything like that. It's about authority exercised in the church and how it is exercised. So it's not saying 2 or 3 substitute for the assembly, because actually the Greek word used here, gathered, is the Greek verb that is used for synagogue. So they already know what this concept is of gathering. As Jews, they would gather habitually at the synagogue, not only at the synagogue, of course, but the synagogue was the gathering place. So when you see this idea of 2 or 3 being gathered, they are, as it were, representative of the larger gathering.
Yeah, of a gathering, of a whole body.
And if you know the context here, going back to verse 15, you see it's about brothers sinning and an attempt at reconciliation by, first of all, the brother who feels sinned against. So it's an attempt at reconciliation that might involve 2 or 3 others, and it might involve the larger assembly.
Yeah, not even just necessarily sinned against himself, but just a sin if he's aware of something that he thinks needs correcting.
Now, you were mentioning that your response to this in the old days when you were a witness.
Well, I can remember on those rare occasions when I was thinking about a text, I remember thinking about this text and having the question in my mind, if Christ is still alive and he's talking to them and he's talking to them about the church, how does that work, since I thought the church happened after he died?
Which it did.
And then they built up a church. So that always kind of puzzled me, because here he's kind of taking it for granted that they know about church, for one thing, and that they know about difficulties arising within church and how to deal with it. That seems to be what he's doing. And I thought, well, if it doesn't exist yet, shouldn't there be some kind of a manual, a church, this is how to start a church.
But there's no church manual in Matthew or any of the Gospels.
No, it's already assumed it's established. So what was established?
Well, this is going back to the meaning of the word again. The church in English comes from a word that relates to the word kurios, so Lord. It actually comes from a building to a community, in English anyway, the concept of church. But in Hebrew, you've got ecclesia, this Greek word, coming from a Hebrew word, kahal, which is related to the word in Ecclesiastes. So you've got Ecclesiastes as the English title of that book, and you've got Koheleth, sometimes you'll see that as the first words when Koheleth, whoever it is that wrote it, and tradition says it was Solomon, is calling an assembly to hear his words. So the root meaning of kahal is to assemble, to call to assembly or congregate people together. Not necessarily as a religious meeting, but it could be. So it would be oftentimes a town hall, as we might call it today, where everybody gets together and discusses a political issue or a local issue of interest to the entire community.
Right.
So the concept is calling or calling out, ecclesia, but not necessarily separating from other members of the community in a religious sense. So the word originally would relate to any assembly of people in Israel, but not necessarily for religious purposes. So they're very familiar with this historical use of this word, and they're already doing it. They're already meeting in regular religious assemblies and others.
Yeah.
So when you have the concept here of, well, in an attempt to reconcile brothers, one of whom feels sinned against, if it fails at the first level, i.e. your personal discussion with the brother,
he doesn't listen to it.
Then bring, he says, right? Back in verse 16.
Bring one or two more. So where are the more coming from?
Well, obviously the community.
Community, right.
And if that fails, and these 2 or 3 witnesses don't manage to effect a reconciliation,
or persuade the person who's sinning,
that's not the end of the issue. You then take it to the church.
Yeah. And this is the question I now see when I read that is, in the Watchtower, it's never brought before the congregation.
Yeah.
We don't even know what the sin was. It's all done in secret, and it's only the elders, but there's no elders being, told only this matter.
Yeah.
And then the congregation just being told this guy's disfellowshipped.
Yeah, this is again rooted in the Jewish way of doing synagogue, that there were no clergy in the synagogue. There might be visiting clergy, i.e. priests, but they're not ruling the synagogue. There is a president who is a kind of a caretaker, or custodian of the synagogue. He's the president. But then the elders, as it were, represent that community. But you notice here, it's not take it to the elders. It's take it to the church.
Yeah.
The church would know the nature of the conflict.
It would be public knowledge, whatever the problem was, if it got to that point. Before that, you're just trying to reconcile a brother to faith, to get him back to seeing things according to the Word. Right?
So then this brings up the whole reason that people assembled as synagogues in the first century. What was the synagogue for? Well, it was community, it was worship of the true God, but it was also public reading of the Word.
Yeah.
That was its primary function.
Yeah, hearing the Word together.
So then you think of it that way and you realize, well, if this person doesn't want to be reconciled to his brother, and doesn't want to hear the words of the representatives of the congregation, the 2 or 3 witnesses, will he listen to the congregation as a whole? Well, you can see where discipline, church discipline, then would come in. When it says, let him be, if he refuses to listen to the church, even to the church, notice it says, even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector.
Yeah, so even the fact that it says Gentile and tax collector should have twigged us into the fact that there was some kind of established thing happening already. That these are Jews talking about gatherings they had. And then treat them as the nations. That did not mean never speak to them. For one thing.
You'd have to have dealings with Gentiles and tax collectors if they're living in your community.
That's right. So it's more about keeping company. Don't invite them for supper, but treat them like people.
They're being treated like non-members of the community, Gentiles and tax collectors. They're not being totally avoided or shunned, but they're also not being invited into the inner core of the religious fellowship.
Yeah.
Sitting at table, as we'll see when we get to Corinthians, is the representative ritual of that.
Yeah.
That if you don't sit at table with someone, you're really not having community with him. And that becomes a big issue, of course, in the relations of the early church, Jews and Gentiles, etc.
I think the other thing that strikes me is that the assumption is that within church life, there's problems.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be difficulties. There's going to be skirmishes that have to be dealt with. It's not a perfect gathering.
And there will have to be discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in the synagogue context, the power of disfellowshipping, as it were, was the community power. It wasn't necessarily administered by representatives of the community, but by the whole community.
Yeah.
And we'll see that again in Corinthians.
They'd all be well aware.
But in the larger context of Matthew 18, you can see how this is related to other issues. Just before it, in Matthew 18, is the argument about who is the greatest in the kingdom. And then stumbling blocks are dealt with from verse 7 to verse 9. And then the parable of the lost sheep. The good shepherd would be the one who goes after the lost sheep and tries to bring him back to the flock.
Yeah.
Christ is not saying that he is the good shepherd will now deal with each individual as an individual. The sheep are still to be gathered into one flock. And the next parable too, the longer parable that follows it, is the parable of the unforgiving servant, about Peter. After this segment from verse 20 onwards, Peter comes up and says, well, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him?
Yeah.
So forgiveness becomes an issue. And the power of forgiveness is not just left to the individual conscience. Here it has something to do with the congregation too.
Yeah, I think it's a community that forgives. You know, it's a forgiving community, if you like. That's what church should be.
Again, back to Jesus' famous words in John 10, that when he brings down the wall between Jew and Gentile, the other sheep, the Gentiles in the traditional understanding, not the great crowd as the witnesses tend to teach about it, not an earthly hope versus a heavenly hope, but rather Jews and Gentiles.
That's right, it's the uniting of these two peoples.
But he doesn't say, I will now have two flocks. There'll be one flock, one shepherd. The barrier that was there before is no longer there. So how unacceptable it should be to us as Christians to allow barriers to grow again between individual Christians or sects to form within the church, but they do. And I think we'll see more about that when we get to 1 Corinthians chapters 1 to 5, that sects are almost inevitable within the church, but when they arise, they are not to be thought of as acceptable. We should always work at reconciliation and knocking down the barriers that develop.
But we should never assume that there will come a time when in the church life that it's a squeaky clean. A clean organization or a clean church.
God's clean organization. Yeah.
Because we're people, all of us needing forgiveness, there will always be those kinds of difficulties arising.
But also the means to reconcile.
Yeah.
Not based on just our individual judgments and individual consciences, but the community conscience.
A method in which the whole community helps with the reconciliation of people and the forgiveness of people and the community watching of one another becomes a pleasant thing rather than a negative thing.
Obviously, the overall message here is that if we're going to be unified as Christians, we have to exercise forgiveness.
Yeah.
And seek reconciliation. And seek peace with all men.
Yeah.
Amen.